All right. Um, Hello everyone. It's been a while. So what I want to go over today is the annotated bibliography structure. This is as close as you guys are going to get to an equation. I think you can memorize and just kind of copy from to write this paper. Um, I'm usually remiss to do stuff like this for writing, but I think that it works really well for this specific paper. So if you follow this outline, this guide, it'll show you paragraph by paragraph how to compose your literature review. Um, Before we get into that, I want to make one really important note. Remember that this is a literature review. It's not an argument paper. This is a informative essay. It is not meant for you to persuade your reader of anything. Um, Remember who the audience is of a literature review. It's an academic audience of like-minded researchers, people who are wanting to do research similar to what you've done, and they're wanting to carry on what you're doing, or they find some similarity between the work they want to do and the work that you've done. Um, so you're not trying to change the way they think about things. You're not trying to um, sway public opinion, anything like that. You're just saying, hey, I've found all these sources, I've found all this information, and I think that more people should be aware of this cool information. Um, that doesn't mean that your literature review can't have a persuasive nature. In the sense that everything's persuasive. You're going to be presenting facts, evidence that has an inherently persuasive nature. So if you are in the back of your mind wanting to be persuasive, the idea is you are not, as the writer, presenting like a argumentative thesis statement that is making an argument. Instead, you're allowing the sources to speak for themselves. So it's fine if there is a argumentative quality to a source that you're using, that there's a source that you're citing that is making an argument, you're summarizing that, and you're conveying what that source is saying. That's great. That's exactly what you're supposed to do. You don't want to make an argument in your introduction. Ultimately, avoid making any kind of argumentative um, statements in your intro, and then let the sources speak for themselves. So it's an informative essay. That's the biggest thing. It's an informative essay. Think of it like a book report. This is a lot closer to a book report than anything else, but instead of doing a report on one single book, you're doing a report on multiple sources. Um, so hopefully that helps. If you give me an argumentative paper, I will not accept it. I will not accept an argumentative essay because you have fundamentally not followed the instructions. You've not written a literature review. You've written something else. So make sure that you are not writing an argumentative essay. So just to cover all of our bases, what the specific thing to avoid is do not have an argumentative thesis statement. Do not write in a way that you, the writer, the speaker that is conveying the text, is not making an argument. If the sources are making an argument and you want to prop that argument up, that's fine. If you want to unpack their argument and kind of push that argument onto the reader, that's fine. But let the sources speak for themselves. You are a passive conduit of the information. So no argumentative thesis statements. Don't make an outright argument in the essay from the perspective of you're the writer. You're allowing the sources to speak for themselves. So it's a informative essay, like a book report. Second, it is, if you want to think of this as like a compare and contrast essay, I think that's great. And I think that will bring more depth to your writing. So if it's just purely informative, it can get kind of boring where you're going, here's a source. It said ABC. Here's another source. It said XYZ. That can get kind of boring. There's not a lot of complexity. There's not many layers. There's not any tension in just like an inventory of information, which you can do that. And if you do that, great, that works. It's exactly what a literature review is meant to do. But if you want a little bit more dynamism, you can compare and contrast your sources. Okay, here's a source. It's saying ABC. And you unpack ABC, you make sure that the reader understands why A, B, and C are important pieces of information. And then in your next paragraph, you might say, now here's another source that said XYZ, which conflicts with the previous sources A, B, and C. And then you can discuss and compare and contrast what these two sources are saying. One source might be saying, hey, we're for this thing. This thing is great. Another source might be saying, hey, we're against this thing. And here's why. You can compare and contrast that. So think of it like a book report, but you're comparing and contrasting one book with another, or one chapter with another, or one character with another, right? Maybe you read a book, one character is a nice guy, the other's a dick, and you compare and contrast their characters. You can do that with this. And so I wanted to make that note that should help you. That should be all that you need to write a really good paper, is write an informative essay where you are not making an argument, but rather you're propping up the arguments of the essay. Or if no one's making an argument in your essay, you're just conveying the information that you found relevant to your topic. And then if you want a more interesting essay, you can compare and contrast your sources. You don't necessarily have to, but I highly, highly recommend it. And so, yeah, think of it like a compare and contrast informative essay. So with that out of the way, let's dive into this outline. So this is everything that you need to write this paper. Your paper needs to follow this structure. So let's dive in. So you need to have an idea of who your audience is. You probably want to put that at the top of your outline. If you want to outline this, you can. Your audience is going to be some sort of academic audience. Thesis statement. So the thesis statement for a literature review should be really simple. It should be not argumentative like we talked about. And you kind of have two options for what to write for your thesis statement. So this statement can be an answer to your research question. So let's say that you ask a research question, and as you're researching, all the sources are in agreement. Like there's an overwhelming consensus of how to answer this question that you had when you began the research. You can present that answer. Now, remember, it's not you presenting the answer, it's the sources. So you want to indicate that in the thesis statement that all sources are in agreement that thesis statement. You want to make sure that this position is coming from the ethos of the sources, not from you as the reviewer. So that's one thing you can do if it turns out that there's a nice clear-cut answer to the research question that you presented. Most likely there isn't, though. Most likely things are really complicated and there's not really a clear-cut answer insofar as there's agreement on that answer. There might be several answers and you might like one answer more than others, but it's not your place yet as a researcher. You know, if you were writing or doing a research project, or you're writing an argumentative essay, it would be your place there, right? But in this genre, it's not our place as researchers to answer based on what we like or don't like, even if that is based in reason or something like that. Instead, we're passive. We're just presenting the information. So if that's the case, if there's not a clear-cut answer, then you can just present a key observation that you've made. And that observation might be, there's no agreement. There's wildly different perspectives on this issue. And there's not really any agreement. That's one observation that you can make. You might have made other observations. So you may have observed that there are multiple different perspectives on this issue, but the community is dominated by two perspectives. Maybe there's, dozens and dozens of potential answers to this problem or perspectives on this issue, but you found a pattern of there's kind of two main perspectives that most people are presenting in their own words, or are their variations of these two, whatever. And so don't overthink this. Whatever you think is interesting, write down. That's why I recommended while you're annotating, while you're reading sources, that you're writing your thoughts down, that you're making observations, and you're writing those things down, and then just go with your strongest one. Don't overthink the thesis statement. It's really not a big deal. Your thesis statement should kind of be an overarching theme. What's sort of a theme that you know that you're going to touch on regularly with these sources? It's not rocket science. It's not argumentative. You're not having to persuade anyone with it. The stakes are really low with the thesis statement. It just needs to be something that you know you're going to come back to, and kind of helps you organize the discussion. By this point, you should know how to write a thesis statement. So if you're not sure how to write a thesis statement, look that stuff up. Go online, how to write a good thesis statement. There's so many great resources out there that can help you write a good thesis statement. And so, yeah. So thesis statement in which you either present an answer, if there's a clear-cut answer, or more likely, present a key observation of some kind. But remember, you're speaking for the sources here. You're not speaking from yourself. You're not presenting your thoughts or opinions here. You are purely saying, this is what the literature is saying. This is what other researchers are doing. If you do have opinions and thoughts on these things, that's great. Save it for the conclusion. The conclusion is the place where you can kind of present those things, but you want to have done all of the work before you get to that point, establishing the sources, establishing your ethos as a reviewer of those sources. Then once you get into the conclusion, you go crazy. So these are two things that you need to know going into before you start writing. Have those two things. Intro, opening remark. Just don't do something cringy here. It doesn't matter. Don't overthink the opening remark. People will sit and stare at a blank page because they're terrified of making the opening remark and it being bad. If anything, skip it. It's really not a big deal. It doesn't have to be funny or deep or pithy or anything. Just start the essay. Trust me. I see too many students, and I struggle with it too, just staring at a blank page because the opening remark just doesn't come to them. Opening remarks are really tough. So I recommend just skipping it, come back to it. But what you do need to do is just establish the topic and tone. And in fact, you don't even really need an opening remark in the sense of like some kind of like catchy hook. Hooks are really for more like popular genres. Like if you're writing like an article or you're writing like a story, you need to have a strong hook. Hooks are overrated. You don't really need a hook. The hook of your literature review is your topic. If someone's not interested in your topic, a great hook is not going to convince them to be interested in your topic. If they are interested in your topic, a bad hook isn't going to scare them away. So don't overthink this. This is far more important. Establish what the topic is and establish some kind of tone. And the biggest thing to do here is provide context. So let's say that you're doing global warming. Huge topic, massive in public consciousness, all kinds of variations to that conversation. You need to provide context. So are we talking about violent weather patterns? Are we talking about sea levels rising? Are we talking about loss of biodiversity? Are we talking about what are we talking about here? You need some kind of context, and you need to establish it quickly. By the second sentence, you need to be into the context and quickly establishing not just what your essay is about, what literature you're reviewing in the most general sense. I'm looking at global warming or whatever, but I'm looking at loss of biodiversity on the Arctic shelf or something like that. Provide that context, get specific as quickly as possible. Remember, you're trying to help those other researchers. You're trying to say like, hey, this is what I'm researching. Here are what my sources are about. And here's the specific angle I'm taking on it. So provide that context, establish what your essay is about in as specific terms as possible. And then your thesis statement, okay, I'm doing global warming, I'm doing loss of biodiversity, and the literature, here's the thesis. The literature indicates that loss of biodiversity will have a number of negative effects. That easy, right? They're all in agreement. Bad stuff's going to happen when we don't have penguins anymore. There you go. So now into the essay itself. So this structure right here, this is like the atom of your essay. Every thing that you're doing is just this. So I'm just going to go over this right here. it's all the same. And then you will do slight variations depending on the context within the essay. So you need to have a couple main ideas. What are main ideas in this specific context, in this genre? So break up your discussion into 2 or 3 larger parts. It's up to you how to do this. There's no right way or wrong way. General rule of thumb is you start with your strongest idea. You don't save your best idea for last. You open with your strongest idea. Whatever you think is the most interesting, the strongest discussion, the most robust discussion you can have, open with that. Beyond that, you're really just figuring out, how do I want this conversation to go? Do I want to break this up by sources, where main idea 1, I'm discussing sources 1 and 2 because I think they go together. I think they're really interesting if I compare and contrast them. I want to open up with that. And then main idea 2, I want to compare sources 3 and 4. I think they compare and contrast in an interesting way. So you can kind of pair up sources that you think go together and then just discuss them. You can also break up by concept, where say, okay, here is main idea 1, biodiversity in general and why it matters. And then you've got 2 or 3 sources. They're all like a part of a larger whole in painting that picture of biodiversity. So main idea 1 is just establishing this concept of like, what is biodiversity? Why does it matter? And then main idea 2 is, okay, now I'm going to look at penguins specifically. I've got these sources. I've got 2 or 3 sources on penguins. Some of those sources I've already discussed in main idea 1, and then I'm going to introduce a new source in main idea 2, but I'm going to be the sources I've already mentioned in main idea 1. I'm looking at different parts of them. There's different information in there that I want to bring back. Or maybe I want to reuse some information, but I want to analyze it more deeply, or I want to take a different angle on it. It does not matter how you do this. It does not matter how you organize everything, as long as you discuss all of your sources. The emphasis of writing this is, yes, to review the literature and convey what these sources are doing, but to do it ultimately in a way that engages those sources, that communicates what is within those sources, as well as try to take those sources forward a step, analyze what's going on in those sources, compare and contrast sources. How does the information in one source kind of open up the information in another source, or cast an interesting light on it? There's not really any hard and fast rule of what has to be done here. Sort of organization to the way that you are conveying this conversation. It can be all the way from the simplest, here's a source, here's what's in it, here's a source, here's what's in it, to here's 2 or 3 sources that all interact in these interesting ways. I'm going to trace out that interaction. Both are valid. Obviously, the more complex essay is more interesting, it's more engaging, it's more academic, but do what makes sense to you. So main idea 1 and then paragraph 1. So every single sentence needs or every single paragraph needs a topic sentence. You need to indicate, what is this sentence about, or what is this paragraph about? Remember when we learned how to speed read, we use topic sentences, right? So there's a great power in topic sentences. Make it so that your essay can be sped read. Indicate what this paragraph is going to be about. These topic sentences are like handholds for your reader, because most likely you might be getting into some fairly complex information. They might get lost at certain points. We're like 4 pages deep into this essay, some pretty complex information. Those topic sentences are like a breath of clarity for your reader. Where, yeah, they may feel a little bit lost, but because they have those topic sentences, they're able to kind of follow the flow and the gist of the conversation as they're going, until things start making sense. So you actually have to have those topic sentences. Like with everything, don't overthink it. Try not to be so simple as like, now we're going to talk about penguins. Be more specific. Also, try not to do like the first, second, third, last thing. You shouldn't need that. Topic sentences should be things like penguins are important elements of the Arctic food chain, and if their populations are disrupted, bad things can happen. And then blah blah blah, where you discuss their place in the food chain and the consequences if their place in it is disrupted. Just say what you're going to talk about. But don't tell the reader, now we're going to talk about this, because it's very like middle school writing. Like, just say it. We're going to talk, just say penguins, blah, 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 and then do the blah, blah, blah. Here's the big one. Here's the thing that a lot of you are not going to do, and it's going to make me super angry, even though I'm about to talk about it. Introduce your evidence. Do not go, penguins are important in the food chain, and then slap a quote down, or slap a statistic down. Um, the purpose of a literature review is to pay homage to the sources, to put these sources kind of on a pedestal and say, look at this important work that this researcher is doing. Look what this researcher has accomplished with their life's work. Imagine if you spent 5 years working on something, and then someone cites it, but then they don't even give your name, right? This would be like, you listen to a song and it features an artist, it features another artist, and when you read that song title, it's like song title, and then like in a bracket or in a parentheses, it says featuring FEAT period and then the artist. If you don't introduce your evidence, it's like you have collaborated with another artist, but then you didn't put featuring in the song title, right? Um, you need to introduce your evidence and indicate where did this source come from. And so the way to do this is by what is called a signal phrase. So I'll write that real quick. Um, we see these a lot. So I'll give an example. And that would actually also be Ethiopia. According to Dr. Smith, 2001 of Harvard University. In their study, name of the study, and then blah blah blah. Every single thing that you do should, at the very, very, very least, have this signal phrase where you attribute who that is. This is your featuring, like, I'm about to write this paragraph and it is featuring Dr. Smith. This is the weak version of that, but it will do. The stronger version would be to do this. Something like this. Penguins, are they in the North Pole or the South Pole? I want to say the North, maybe. Sure. Um, I'm making this shit up as I go, so sorry if this is wrong. Um, Something like this is even better, where you are indicating not only who did this study, you're giving them that feature tag, but you're also giving a little bit of information about the study itself. So this is a signal phrase. This is much, much better. Where you give a little bit of and you have to do a little bit of legwork. You know, if you have a really awesome source, see who did it, and then see if there's any information you can find about when they did it, what the conditions were, so you can talk a little bit about who they were and what the conditions were of the study. Now you might not be able to find it. It might not be interesting like this. Maybe it happened in a lab and super boring. It's just a bunch of deep cut science crap, in which case the signal phrase is more than sufficient. But if there's some interesting contextual information surrounding the study or the source or whatever, you can do this. And this is much better than the signal phrase. But again, the signal phrase is fine. You need to do this for every single source. You need to have some kind of introduction to the source. If you don't do this, um, it's, in a word, unethical. You're basically, it's not plagiarism if you're citing correctly, um, but it's very much frowned upon in this in the community, in the same way that it would be frowned upon that if you as an artist collaborated with someone and then they did not give you that feature in the song title, and make it very apparent, like, hey, I collaborated with this person. They put just as much into this as I did. Um, that would ruffle feathers, right? You would be upset by that. And so do your due diligence and indicate, give that person their moment. They did a lot of work on this topic that you care about. They spent, their blood, sweat, and tears to produce this source so that you could use it. Um, give them those few seconds of your time to do this signal phrase. So it's morally and ethically the correct thing to do and is therefore expected. Um, but also, you need to establish the ethos, right? If you just say, if you're reading something and someone just throws a random statistic out and they're like, penguins are not doing great, you're like, and source, I've heard all kinds of crap. Why should I believe you? There's no ethos to that. Versus if someone's like, hey, this Dr. Smith of Harvard University spent some time in Greenland and they found that XYZ, you're like, interesting, tell me more. That has ethos to it. And a literature review in which you have not established ethos in spades, where you don't, there's not an obvious professional um, underpinning to your writing, you have failed, right? Because ultimately, your reader, an academic reader, does not care about the information. They don't care about um, what is being said. They care how it came to be said that way. Where is this information coming from? If it's a statistic, who did the study? Where? How? Why? Who was funding them? All of those things. We care a lot more about the source itself than we care about what the statistic is being given. And until that is understood, you can't really write academically. Understanding that scholars have a very high bar when it comes to ethos. And if they do not trust in the source, they do not trust the information. It's not like in the real world where if it just sounds nice to someone and just confirms the way they already think about the world, they just believe it. Academics are not built that way. We are naturally skeptical of absolutely everything until given reason otherwise. This is your reason otherwise. You're saying, hey, here's why this is a good statistic. This little bit of work has a massive effect on your reader. Versus if this is left out, your paper is just digging a hole for itself and becoming less and less believable. And if a literature review doesn't have ethos, isn't believable, it's pointless. It's a complete waste of your time. So introduce your evidence. If you don't do this, I'm going to be so mad. I'm going to be so mad. We're going to talk. We're going to do conferences. We're going to talk about it. If you don't do this, and it's a lot more difficult to go in and add these in later than it is to just write it out real quick while you have the source in front of you. So introduce your evidence before you give your evidence. So you introduce it according to blah blah blah, and then you give the evidence. And this can be in the other half of this sentence, right, where you signal according to Dr. Smith, blah 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 blah, and then 45% of penguins, are experiencing difficulties finding fish, blah blah blah. So there's your evidence. Now, the worst thing that you can do, the thing that will, I'll bust a gasket, uh, is if you end a paragraph on a statistic or a quote. You never, ever, ever just give a quote or a stat and then just move on, right? Because basically what you're saying is, um, uh, here, reader, figure it out. Figure out for yourself why this is relevant or significant. You always unpack it. If it's a quote, unpack it, put it into your own words. Say that Dr. Smith said that penguins are integral to the food chain, and if they are displaced, it can lead to crushing losses in biodiversity that are necessary for, um, you know, pioneering new medications or something like that. And then you would say, like, why is that significant? You can pick anything you want to talk about. It might be um, just your thoughts on why losing penguins are better, even better, making connections to other things being said. It's kind of difficult in this first paragraph of the whole essay, but later on, as you're giving quotes and statistics, it's going to deepen other quotes and statistics given previously in the essay. So let's say that way down in this, so maybe paragraph 3, we're looking at fish populations, and there's another study showing that like fish are disappearing from the Arctic. Uh, they're going like further north, trying to stay in the more frigid temperatures. And you might say, you know, give statistic. There's 40% less fish in X region of the sea, and say this could explain why the penguin population discussed in Dr. Smith's study is cratering. Why that population is cratering. Um, Start making connections. So you can explain it. If it's a quote and it's like kind of dense, you can just explain it, put into your own words, like what's going on here. You can analyze it. If it's a statistic or something like that, explain why is this significant. So much of academic writing is just saying like, oh, I see what this is. I see what you're doing there. It's just explaining, like, you're making observations and you're saying, when I read this quote or I read the statistic, it's making this neuron fire, and then put that on the page, right? Whatever thought you're having is enough. It's just conveying the observations that you're making, the things that you are seeing going on beneath these sources, beneath these statistics, quotes, whatever. That is sufficient. Just put it on the page, and then or make connections as you get deeper into the paper, especially deeper into each section. You get into paragraph 3, 4, 5 of a section. You should be making lots of connections, showing like, okay, here's a new statistic, and it interacts in a really interesting way with this statistic given in paragraph 2, and here's how, and then explaining that. So the biggest issue students have in writing is the same in math, not showing their work. They want to make the observations, and then they feel like that's enough. It's not. You need to show your thinking process, and it's not fluff. A lot of students think like, oh, that's fluff. I'm just explaining what is to me very obvious. Just because it's obvious to you doesn't mean it's obvious to your reader. Assume that it's not. Remember that uninformed reader that hopefully you learned about in high school. Assume that everything that you're saying to your reader makes enough sense that they understand what you're saying, but that they need a little bit of help following. And so help them follow things, state the obvious, show those things that you're seeing. Um, so much of writing is just stating what is obvious to you, but you're smart, right? It's obvious to you, but that doesn't mean it's obvious to others. Um, and then finally, you can connect your explanation or analysis, the stuff going on up here, to your thesis. So if your thesis is something like penguins are disappearing, and then here you talk about penguins food chain being disrupted. you can discuss that. You know, the food chain disruption of these Arctic penguins is one contributing factor to the larger collapse of the penguin population or whatever. You can connect to your thesis, and then from there you can transition. If you're within the main idea one still, then you can transition. Don't overthink transition. You don't have to have transitions. Transitions are really aren't needed if you have a good topic sentence. If you have a good topic sentence here, you don't really need a transition. I just put this here because this is where a transition would technically go. This is a much better thing to do, is to make that connection to the thesis and then jump into the next idea. So don't worry about transitions. The only time that you need a transition is if you are making a gigantic leap in logic. If we're going from talking about penguins here to talking about like the populations of saber-toothed tigers in 3 billion years ago or whatever. I don't think they were saber-toothed tigers. 2 million years ago. If you feel like the reader is going to kind of balk at why are we talking about this, you can transition. It's really not a big deal. So this is everything that you need to do. If you do this paragraph by paragraph, then you will have an excellent essay. So the last thing I want to talk about is varying this structure. So let's say that in paragraph 1 that you want to talk about these penguins and stuff, and in that paragraph you go on to talk about the disruption of their food chain, and then in paragraph 2 you want to continue using the Dr. Smith source, but you want to continue that discussion, but now you want to discuss like a different element of it or something like that. Maybe you want to talk about polar bear populations as well, and like the symbiosis between polar bears and penguins or something. Then you might not need some of this stuff. For instance, you don't need to introduce the evidence because you still have the introduction here. You would still do like Smith 2001. You might say like in the same studies, in the same study by Smith 2001, blah, blah, blah. You don't need this again, right? You probably want to still use this, but maybe not. Maybe you want to continue discussing in the same vein as up here. Maybe the paragraph's just gotten really long, and you're wanting to kind of shift ideas a little bit, but you're mostly still staying within that conversation. Then you might not need a topic sentence. You might not need to introduce evidence. You just need to introduce a new piece of evidence. You don't need these every single time. And so every paragraph should have at least 2 of these. Every paragraph should at the very least have this. Every single paragraph has to have you discussing evidence, analyzing evidence, making connections. You should never not have this. You always have you discussing something, but it's a question of what are you discussing? Are you discussing evidence? Let's say that you get down here, paragraph or main idea 3, paragraph 3, you're deep into the paper. You might just have this where you're at toward the end of the paper, end of this third idea. It's the paper is at the height of its complexity. You might just want to take a moment to just discuss and make like fine-grained connections between sections and stuff like that. Maybe that's all you need, where you're analyzing, you're making lots of connections, and then you're connecting that analysis to the thesis and stuff like that. So you can have a paragraph that's just doing this. As long as every paragraph you are doing something, you are contributing something to the discussion, then that's great. Every section, every main idea section needs to have evidence, needs to have sources. You shouldn't have any sections where you're just going out on a limb and just discussing from within. Everything needs to have it. So every section should have all of these things happening and should have at least one paragraph, most likely the first paragraph, that is doing all of these. But after that first paragraph, you can vary it depending on what you need. The thing to understand is that this is kind of the atom of the essay, and each of these individual elements is in a lot of ways a tool that helps you accomplish the task of the literature review, but each paragraph you might need a different set of tools to accomplish whatever you're trying to accomplish in that paragraph. But as long as you understand, like, this is the basic, this is the fundamental structure, and that each of these are kind of a building block, uh, and then you can use it as you see fit. So this is it. This is the structure. If you do this, um, if you want to outline your paper, you can. We'll have this week. We're going to start working on second drafts. If you want to do this as an outline, to just start organizing all of your sources, I highly recommend it. I'm not going to assign the outline because we're running a little bit behind now. I usually like to do these outlines, but if you want to start writing, you can, and just have this to the side. But yeah, you need to follow this structure. And then there's some notes down here about thesis statements and stuff like that you're welcome to look at. And then I've also included roundabout where your pages, you'll be around page 6 by here, so on and so forth. These aren't hard and fast, they're just kind of guides, indicators. Yeah. So in the email that I'll send out with this, you'll have your assignment for the week, which is to begin working on the second draft of your paper, which is an essay. You are writing the essay now. You have the sources. Begin organizing your sources into this structure. As you're writing, I want you to find a fourth source. You have 3 sources right now. I want you to find a fourth source. As you're organizing, you should identify some kind of gap. Let's say that you get in a paragraph or main idea 2. You have enough for maybe 1 paragraph, but you think, now that I have my main ideas, now that I know how I want this discussion to go, I see now that I have plenty of sources for my first main idea, but I think for the second main idea, I need another source, kind of like my third source, to round out this discussion. Go get that source. You know how to find it. Because you know what kind of source you're looking for, you'll know your keywords that you're going to look for. Go find that. You don't have to do the whole find 10, cut down to 5, so on and so forth. You can just go find a good source. But you have to do an annotated bibliography entry for it. For every source that you add in this paper, you have to have an annotated bibliography entry. And so at this point, you can start finding as many. So I'm going to require 4 now, but you can add as many sources as you want. I don't recommend going over 8 sources for the essay. But with that said, know that every source that you include, you have to do an annotated bibliography entry. So think hard, like, is this worth bringing on? Am I going to use this completely and fully and get a lot of value out of this source? Because if not, if I'm just mining it, cherry picking 1 quote from it, but now you got to spend the next, 10, 15, 20 minutes writing up a summary of a source that you're not really going to use, right? And so hopefully this keeps us from cherry picking and mining quotes that we're not going to use. One thing I don't want to see, I see it a lot, students writing these papers and then their sources, all of their sources, their page numbers are page 1, where the students clearly opened the source, read like the first paragraph or 2 until they hit a line that was relevant, and then they just copy paste that over and then put the source down. Please don't do that. Read your sources. Engage with your sources. People put a lot of work into these. I'm not going to preach about it, but yeah, if I get an essay and it's all page 1, page 1, page 1, page 1, like, I'll still accept that, but I'm definitely gonna like sigh and be like, come on, bro, like, put the work in. So yeah, all that stuff that I've just discussed, assignment wise, I will have in the email that's with this. And then later this week, I'll do another one of these lectures on the short story that'll kind of walk you through, similarly to this, how the short story will work. And then you'll also be assigned to start working on the second draft of the short story. Those will be due probably around the 3rd week, so about a month from now, about around the 3rd week of November is when we'll have those due. And you can work on whichever one you want to work on from here on. It's all just going to be workshop days. All right, I'm going to stop here. Get to work.